Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consol, your host. Two quick things before introducing you to my guest. First, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast by clicking on the follow button and also clicking on the bell icon so you're alerted to each new edition of the program. Second, in addition to being the producer of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I've written 4 books, 3 novels, and 1 short story collection. In the episode notes, you will find a short link to my Amazon page and all 4 of those titles. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is multi-award-winning Canadian author Douglas Smith. He writes novels, short stories, and nonfiction, having published his work in more than 200 short fiction publications in 36 countries and 27 languages, writing about fantasy, science fiction, and the indefinable. Among his nonfiction books is one titled Playing the Short Game, How to Market and Sell Short Fiction. Douglas Smith, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Mike. This is great.
Let me start by asking you, if you're at a cocktail party, somebody approaches and says, "What do you do?" What do you tell them?
Uh, when I was working, I'd probably talk about what my day job was. Now that I'm retired, I probably will say, I'm retired and I'm spending my time writing. Um, yeah, I mean, I started with short fiction, so it was pretty clear out of the gate that you're never going to be able to give up the day job on short fiction.
Now, you went from short fiction to novels as well, though. I mean, was that partly? I know that I had a short story writer on here recently who said, he's got in his book has done really well at the Continental Divide. Actually, is his collection of short stories. But he said that he's got an agent now, and his agent said, a novel. You need to write a novel. And I said, why did you say that? And he said, well, same reason you were mentioning that short fiction is hard to sell. The short story collections are hard to sell. I mean, not for John Updike, not for Ernest Hemingway, not for Alice Munro, but for the
Yeah,
rest of us
yeah.
mortals who don't already have an outsized reputation as novelists, that really doesn't it doesn't go so well. So what about moving from short stories to full-length novels? What did you intend all along that you wanted to write novels, and you had
Yeah,
just
yeah.
started with short stories?
I started with short stories. It's actually something I recommend to beginning writers, and we can maybe talk about that a bit. But I always intended to move to novels. Um, when I started out writing just in my spare time while I had a day job, and knocking out a short story seemed to be a lot more a reasonable project when you don't know exactly how much time you're going to have. And I also I recommend people start with short stories because I think it's a great way to learn the craft of prose. The example I give, you can start by trying to write your 100,000 word novel. It's probably not going to be very good because you don't know how to write yet. Or you can spend those 100,000 words um, trying 20 different short stories, 5,000 word short stories. And in those 20 stories, you're going to be able to practice different points of view, present tense, past tense, unreliable narrator, different genres. I write science fiction, fantasy, horror, a bit of everything. I can write 20 stories and try dabble in all of those things. There are also great ways to get or to test out maybe an idea for a novel. Certainly, my very first short story ended up being essentially a prequel to what my first novel was. So I think short fiction is a great way to learn your craft and try out some ideas and try out different genres.
I remember talking to a short story writer, and I asked him, "Do you write short stories because you have so many ideas that you'd never be able to produce that many novels?" And he thought there was something to that, but he wasn't exactly down with that. One of the things when I started writing short stories, it was exactly for that reason that I felt like, God, there's a bunch of things I want to write about, and I'm never gonna produce that many novels. It would just take way too long. I couldn't even do it in this lifetime. So I started doing that, but I'm curious when you moved from, I mean, your advice is well received that the ability to learn the craft before you try to tackle the marathon. But what about when you were writing a short story? Do you feel like your short stories had the same requirements as a novel in terms of an arc and a protagonist who evolved during the story and so on? Or are there certain elements to a novel that with a short story you just don't need to worry about?
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, in a short story, I'm trying to introduce a compelling character with an interesting problem and put them into a difficult situation, and I want to have I'll call it a satisfying arc. Which means, the reader starts out with that character and goes on that journey, and by the end of it, they say, yeah, based on, the decisions that character made and choices they faced, this is a satisfying conclusion. That means could be happy, could be sad, could be bittersweet, could be whatever. I think the challenge with a short story is you've got to do that within very few words. Um, you've got to give the reader someone they can relate to and give them a satisfying journey as they go along with that character. You have to become very good at um, intimating at a larger universe around this character. You don't have the words in a novel to, go in deeply into setting, and definitely backstory. You have to hint at backstory. I mean, I like to think all of my short stories, the characters, you learn of a backstory, but you probably don't see as much of it as you would in a novel. And therefore, you really have to learn what are the critical little hints I can give as to what brought this character to this point in their lives.
So let me ask you, when you decided, okay, I'm going to write a novel now, I've explored the
Hmm.
short story, I've learned lessons that I needed to learn. Did you approach the novel at all in terms of, yes, it's 100,000 words, but I'm going to write, 25 or 30, 35, 40 short stories, basically. Did you tackle each obviously they need to be connected. There needs to be continuity. But I'm wondering if in order to, 'cause they talk all the time. When I say they, I'm talking about people who write about things like managing projects or accomplishing projects. They always talk about divide it into smaller pieces. Don't look at this big project as one big project. Divide it down and
Yeah.
then take it, in almost a modular approach.
Yeah, yeah, sure. It's, what they say, how you eat an elephant one bite at a time. Um, uh, so I guess
I mean, were you consciously
to
doing that, or was it, or did you just say, I don't really feel like I need to do that. I'm just going to write the novel and, chapter by chapter, not treat it like a bunch of short stories.
Well, it's definitely not a bunch of short stories because for me, a short story is complete in itself. So, if I did that, I'd have a collection of short stories. So, you get the idea for the novel, and as I said, I took one of my earliest short stories. It was actually an award-winning short story called Spirit Dance, urban fantasy, shapeshifters, um, and so I knew my main character and I knew some of the characters from that story were going to reappear. And then I decided this is going to be about 5 years later. So, where is my character at that point? So I had that.
Hmm.
And then I knew I needed to have a problem for him, a much different problem than obviously in the first short story. Um, and uh, this series, these characters, that universe that I write in there, it's focused on environmental issues, habitat protection for animals, etc., because they're shapeshifters and they're trying to protect their animal species. So I knew I was going to go with some sort of environmental threat. Um, so I had that. And what I do with any novel is I take my character, decide where they are at the start. Um, Give them some sort of problem in their life. It might not be the problem of the book, but you need to not have them start out being totally happy. And then what I do is for the novel, and this was my first novel, I said, I'm going to make it easy on myself. I'm going to use a classic three-act structure. So what I did for that was, okay, how am I going to start? Okay, I think I've got that. Where am I going to be at the end of the first act? What is going to be the sort of the triggering event at the end of the first act that propels us into the second act? And then by the end of the second act, you've really got to be just running towards the climax. So, okay, what's going to happen at the end of the second act? And I had those, and I had a rough idea what the ending was going to be. I knew, who would live, who would die. I knew where the setting for the ending would be. I knew who my good guys and bad guys were, and what the major conflicts would be. So I've got what I call the tent poles. The opening, the Act One
Hmm.
ending, the Act Two ending, and what the climax is going to be. And then once I have that, and it really applies to, I'm working on my fifth novel now, and I sort of take the same approach with every one. Um, Although the last novel was four acts, it was just too big. Um, but I don't do an outline beyond that. So, I've used there's a great quote I came across years ago by E.L. Doctorow. And he was trying to something like this. He was trying to describe to somebody what's it like to write a novel. And he said, it's like driving across the desert at night. He said you can only see as much of the road ahead of you as your headlights illuminate, but
Yes.
you can still drive across the entire desert that way. So you're going down the road and curve to the right's coming up. So you're prepared for that. The way I write is once I have my tent poles and my major characters and their problem, and what the main issue in the book will be, I'll do about anywhere from 2 to 4 chapters, depending on how that chunk is going and how confident I feel about that section. And then I'll take a look at it. And I tend to be someone who can't go ahead. I'm not happy with the story unless I can read the chapters and say, yeah, this is good. I like this. I don't polish the
You, you,
prose down to down
you
to a
don't like
shine, but
you don't like forging ahead and then going back and redoing everything. You want a
no,
finished
no.
chapter before you embark on the next,
Yeah, so I
or a
will write.
90% anyway, 90% finished.
Yeah, exactly. I'll write in chunks of typically 3 to 4, sometimes 5 chapters. I've got a critique group, and I'll give them a chunk, and I'll hear back from them. And unless they come up with something horrible, like, wow, this makes no sense. This doesn't work. Your logic totally falls down here. Um, I'll fix any major problems they found, and I go ahead with the next 2, 3, 4, 5 chapter chunk. And I just feel confident that way. I could not write, the example you threw, I could not write as a lot of the pros give the advice of just write your first draft, just get it done, and then go
Hmm.
back and fix it. I could not do that. I would be stressing the entire time. And I also find that the way I write, um, I discover things. I discover characters that I never would have thought of if I limited myself to writing from an outline and plot turns and things. I just find I don't know what my characters are really thinking until I'm writing that chapter with them in that scene and they have to make a decision. And
Yeah,
I think a
Joan
lot of,
Didion used to say, "I don't know what I think about anything until I write about it." And
yeah,
then she was not talking about
yeah,
fiction. She was talking about just, she was mostly a nonfiction writer anyway. But your point is taken. So you do a light body outline, and you leave yourself plenty of space with it between the tent poles, so that it almost sounds like you're doing an outline, a very high level outline, and leaving yourself the ability to write organically within that and see how things turn out, and then massage it from there, or trash it and make another run at it.
yeah. I've never had to trash it. After I read this first novel, I said, well, that was easy. Let's do a trilogy. I'm being sarcastic. It was like, oh my God. Um,
Well, I was just
but
thinking of
I
a
haven't.
section, maybe like just a
Yeah,
chapter
yeah.
that's like, is this isn't working? I'm better off starting anew. But maybe that's not all writers are like that. You might not be like that. You might not like throwing copy out, but rather
I,
to
I hate
rewrite it.
Yeah, I hate doing that. And the reason I mentioned the trilogy was I got to the third act in the second book, and I was pretty well, I don't know, 80% of the way through that. And I just said, no, this is not working. And I just went back and redid that third act. And one of the reasons it wasn't working is I realized book three, obviously, better provide all the answers of the mystery that I'd raised. It's a three book mystery basically, and so I had to scrap that part, sit down, and essentially do an interview with myself and say, okay, what are all the questions you've raised in the book so far, and what are the answers? And as I said, I don't write for an outline because I did not yet have the answers to all those questions, even though I'd raised them. Um,
Hmm. Now, did you
so
do that with short stories as well, or was that a different? Did you outline your short stories? Was it tent poles then too, or did you treat that differently?
when I first started, I was very much an outliner. So I would have, okay, these are the scenes I want. Um, and then write the scenes, often not writing them in order. I mean, the very first short story I mentioned a lot, the first thing I wrote was the very final scene, which is kind of fun because then you have this target and you cannot go off map when you have the final scene very clear. But I started with outlining short stories. And then more recently, like, I've been writing short stories for like a quarter of a century. So if I write a short story now, um, I guess I'm still outlining it, but it's all in my head. I just know, okay, I'm going to do this and they're going to do that and I'll do that. And I may flip the sequence of a couple of these. Maybe I'll want a flashback there or something, but I don't write an outline. A short story, I can hold it in my head.
Now, what lessons did you learn when you were writing short stories? For example, you had mentioned, first person, second person, third person. Um, did you discover in that process? I mean, maybe start with that. Do you have a
Yeah.
preference for first or third person, or what do you think?
Um, my very first story was written in first person. Because one of my favorite genre writers of the time was a U.S. writer, Roger Zelazny, and he did a lot of the stories I loved of his were first person. Um, what I found is that first person is a couple things. It's hard to write without making your protagonist come across as an arrogant jerk.
Mhm.
Um, you have to still show all their weaknesses and foibles so that the reader can relate to it. So that's one warning. It's harder to write that. And the second one is I think a lot of beginning writers think first person is going to be, it's how I get the closest to the reader. They're going to feel really connected with this character if I write it in first person. It's actually the opposite. First person is more distancing than limited uh, third person point of view where you're in that character's head. Um, and I think it's because they will read something that starts, I walked into the room or something, and at some subconscious level, the reader is saying, no, I didn't. That's not me. But if you write as a third person, I think it's easier for them to put themselves into that character's shoes if it's third person. I don't know if that makes any sense. I certainly
Yeah.
find it. So I tend to write third person, past tense.
And you actually find that to be more intimate or closer to the reader than first person. The other thing
Yeah,
about first person, I know a lot of times people they run into the problem of trying to hide the I. You don't want to write a bunch of prose where you're just saying I. Um,
right.
and that's, I think, common of an amateur who's just getting started, and it's the mistake that they make. What are some of the other lessons, though, that you feel like you learned writing short stories that you were able to apply, well, to future short stories into your novels?
I just go back to it's how I learned the craft. I know that when I was writing short stories, my drafts tended to be very long. They might be over 7,000 words. And most short fiction markets at that time, we're talking late 90s, um, you not too many of them took something over 5,000 words or 6,000 words. I'm talking about genre markets. So I became very good at taking a hard look at my prose on a sentence by sentence basis and learning how to cut and write a tighter sentence and drop unnecessary words, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so it was sort of a combination of being a beginning writer, and there was a lot of things I could improve in a sentence, driven by the fact that if I wanted to send that story anywhere else, I better cut it down. Um, so I know back then I could probably, if it's a 7,000 word story, I probably could do line edits to get it down under 6,000, just line edits. Um, Now I know I can't. I'd be lucky to get 5% cut in what I write now, just because, you learn how to write, and your first draft of a sentence is a lot better than when you first started out. Um, what else? Just what I said before. I mean, anytime when I started out, when I wrote a new short story, I said, okay, what are you going to try this time? I wanted to try something different every time. Um, so I did fantasy and
So you're intentionally experimental with
yeah, very intentionally. So I did science fiction, fantasy, horror. I did humor. Um, I did unreliable narrator. I probably I'd have to run through all my high fantasy, purposefully, playing with the tropes of high fantasy. Um, I tried all the classic monsters and just tried to put my own spin on it. So, I had a shapeshifter story. Um, I had what have I done? I did a vampire story without really knowing I did one. I read
Hmm.
one review, and the reviewer said this is a very un unusual and innovative take on vampirism. I'm going, oh, I wrote a
I
vampire
didn't
story?
even
Okay.
realize that.
I didn't realize that, yeah.
Now you
But
mentioned the
it
author.
just,
Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Finish that thought.
I would again recommend to writers starting out that you use short stories. I guess I had the advantage. I read across all those genres. If you're someone who's only reading in one genre and only wants to write in one genre, even then there's still so much you can do in terms of past tense, present tense, um, different points of view, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, I
So
believe the
start
writer.
with short fiction.
Yes, yes, that's the message. Start with short fiction. Something I did not do, and I wrote myself into a corner two or three times, trying to do write things organically. And it's like, well, I better think this through a little bit more before putting the fingers at a keyboard. You mentioned an author, Roger Zelazny, and
Zelazny, yeah.
I believe there's a story. He's the guy who unwittingly got you really writing in earnest, correct? Am I remembering this right?
Yeah, okay, you've done your research.
Yeah, a little bit of it.
Yeah, I loved his work. Started reading him in university, and I always said one day I'll be a writer, and everyone says one day I'll be a writer, and when I find the time. So we family went on vacation one summer, and I came back from that vacation, and one of the first things I read was the last name's obituary, and I think he was only 56. And I don't know, I was probably around 40 at the time. And I remember clearly reading that, being shocked and upset that I'd never get new stories from him. But I also remember telling myself, you cannot count on having the time to write someday. So I started writing that summer.
That's a great motivator when you know the clock's ticking. I mean, it's
Yeah,
ticking on all of us, and when we really put that at the forefront of our mind, it's kind of like bust a move.
yeah,
We need
yeah,
need to just get going because
yeah.
time eventually runs out. So you went to literary journals around the country, around the world, maybe with your short stories. Talk about what's the key to being successful? Obviously, writing good short stories, but I suspect you could look at somebody and say, these are good short stories, but here's why you haven't been published in these literary journals. You're making some mistakes in approaching them or whatever. Or is it very straightforward? It's kind of like you go to that journal and they tell you exactly how to submit it, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, they'll all tell you how to submit. They won't tell you why they rejected you. So I think the one secret is well, let me clarify one thing is I do write some mainstream literary stories. I actually have a couple in my next collection that's coming out, but mostly I write genre like science fiction, fantasy, horror, slipstream, mix of everything. So I'm not submitting to literary journals. I'm submitting to a science fiction magazine, a fantasy magazine, a horror magazine, or the equivalent anthology, where they're looking for
Mm.
short stories in a particular genre. Um, the one clue or one piece of advice I give to writers is, well, two things. One is start at the top, um, because a lot of beginning writers will make the mistake of, okay, I've written a short story. I'm really proud of it. I think it's ready to go out. And they send it to some magazine, some market way down the list because they never think of, wow, I should send this to the top market in the field. They'll tell themselves, well, I'm just beginning. They're not going to want something from me. I'm probably not very good. Might be true, but you're never going to find out if you're any good unless you send it to the very best markets possible. So that's my one rule. I followed it since I started. You find the best market in whatever genre you're writing, and you send your story there first. So top market first. When it gets rejected, and it probably will, you go to your market list, which you've compiled, and you go to the second best market in wherever you're writing, and send your story to there next. So that's one piece of advice, and the other piece of advice is get a thick skin, get used to rejections, because it's going to happen. And when you get a story back from a market and they give you a rejection, don't brood on it. Do not try to fix it, even if they give you feedback on it. People will say, why? Um, the example I give is when I started writing, I had a story I was really proud of, sent it out to a couple of markets. One market came back and said, I really like the way this started, but it didn't hold my interest. So they liked the opening. They didn't like the rest. The
Mm.
other market said, okay, it was kind of slow, but it kept my interest. I read it all the way through. I really liked the ending. So they were saying exactly the opposite things. One liked the
Hmm.
ending and not the opening, and the vice versa. So what would I have done with that story if, whose advice would I have listened to? So I just kept it in the mail. That's my other piece of advice. Just keep them in the mail. And that
What do you mean
story,
keep them in the mail? You keep
keep them
mailing
in
them
the,
out
yeah,
to
yeah.
yeah, to other magazines
Find
or
find your
journals.
next market and send it out. Keep it in the mail. Keep it in the
So
email.
stick
Keep it
by
in,
your
keep
story.
submitting. Yeah.
And yeah,
Keep
I
submitting
mean,
it.
and if you had gotten feedback, I mean, like you say, it's rare that they'll tell you why they're rejecting it. But if you did get several saying the same thing, that would be different. But yeah, you get completely, I've talked to writers, it's same thing completely. You just chase your tail.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, if you listen to every piece of input or criticism. So how does that apply? I don't want to go off of this subject entirely, but I don't want to let this slip by. How does that apply to a writers group? Because you show your stuff to writers groups and you're going to get, I'm assuming that this writers group that you're in, you've vetted and or been in it for a while and you respect the people in it, but you're going to get varying opinions there. What are the pros and cons of being in a writers group?
Um, First of all, I write about this in the newest edition of Playing the Short Game because there is writers group can be very helpful to a beginning writer. They can also be incredibly damaging. Um, a lot of them are just giving their feedback and they're feeding their own ego with what they're telling you about the story. So, the group I'm in, I've known these people for years. Um, and you get to know the strengths and weaknesses of a critique group as well. So, we've got one person in our group who is absolutely amazing at finding repeated words in close proximity to each other. Like you
Hmm.
use the word, I don't know, diaspora here, and then like 4 lines later, you use it again, something like that. She's
Hmm.
absolutely great at that. Others are very good at sort of a source of knowledge. So if I have anything that's sort of to do with nature or in the environment, I know one of my members will pick up on that and make sure I'm correct, etc. So you do learn your strengths and weaknesses, and you'll know that some of them will never like a certain type of story, so you can degrade their feedback. Um, the rule I give is that if someone makes a criticism of a story, constructive criticism, and they're the only one who point that out, then what I do is I say, does that resonate with me? Like, okay, I don't care if anyone else did notice it, but if I hear that feedback and go, yeah, you've got a point, then I'll make the fix. If I disagree with it and nobody else mentions it, then I'll just ignore that. If everybody in your group or most of them all say, yeah, that character, their reaction in this scene totally doesn't match what you said their motivation was, then you've got a problem. So you got to fix that. So
Hmm.
it's a bit of common sense, but I do warn beginning writers that critique groups can be damaging. If you're not good at hearing feedback, even if it's done in a positive, constructive manner, you might want to um, reconsider that. When we started it, we met face to face, so there was sort of that, the common, if you're sitting across the table from somebody, you are at least polite.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, it definitely, yeah, you see that with social media where people are willing, especially when their identity is
yeah,
masked, they're willing to say anything. And
yeah.
it's just not, we're face to face. They probably would be nice people if they were face to face. So I suspect once you started to sell your short stories, they were getting accepted by the magazines you were writing to. Did did the momentum pick up? I mean, is part of it just breaking through to one of them that kind of opens the door for to others, or is it strictly my stories just got better and people started seeing that they had a quality that they wanted in their magazine?
No, it's always the quality of the story. Um, the I'll give one story. So I sold one of my early stories to a UK science fiction magazine called Zone. It was a big thing back then. It's still around. It's not doesn't quite have the cachet. Um, and it was actually I thought what you said. I said, I made it. I've broken through. I've got into one of the biggies. And I still remember my total shock when I sent the next story to that same editor and I got a rejection back. In fact, I never sold another story to that magazine, to that editor, until the editor changed. And then I subsequently sold it again to them. So it's always the story. You're going to find editors who like your stuff, but you still have to give them a really good story. Um, so yeah, I'd say I started selling because I just kept sending stuff out there. I think my writing improved, so the stories were better and better. But I'll make one other comment about rejections, because a lot of beginning writers I talk to, they'll say, "Oh, I got this story. I'm really happy with it, but I've sent it out and it's been rejected twice now or three times." And I said, I'm sorry, that story is still a virgin. I've had stories, I made over, I think, $3,000 on one story, and it had been rejected 24 times up to then. But it sold to a top US market when it finally sold. I've had other stories that when I wrote the first edition of Short Game, I gave these examples. I said, look, I've got two stories that sold finally after more than 10 years, and to pro markets, and they each had accumulated over 60 rejections.
Hmm.
Um, since then, I've got a new record. I've got a story that sold to a pro magazine and it had accumulated 80 rejections. You never know. There's no such thing as too many rejections. Now, I will
Well,
I will say when I started writing, I thought I'd gotten better, Mike. I would look at the ones that had been getting rejections and I'd go over them and I might tweak them, but there was no story that I totally ripped apart and redid. Basically, keep it in the mail.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, that's the thing. It's such a subjective thing. I mean, then you get it in the hands of an editor. It's like, wow, I like the pacing, I like the voice, I like the style, and boom, it connects. It's just so subjective. I mean, it is like writing songs and trying to get those sold.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so you were writing short stories for about 10 years, it sounds like. And then when you
yeah.
started to
And then,
sell. So,
no,
okay, that's a
I sold, I wrote 10 years of short fiction basically before I said, okay, let's try a novel. But I sold my first short story. Um, I started sending them out in late 95, and I sold my first one New Year's Eve, 1996. So it was a bit over a year before I had my first sale. Um, and it had been bounced about a half dozen times at that point. But
not bad,
what you said
just a half
before,
dozen.
it wasn't bad. No,
But
it was a good
there is the
story.
famous story that everybody knows. I assume everybody knows Stephen King putting um, his rejection letters on a board under a thumbtack, and then it became I guess a nail, and eventually it was a spike because he accumulated so many rejection letters. But then, boom, and he was writing short stories at the time. Probably not unlike the categories that you're writing some of the time. And then he obviously unbelievable success story. So the when you decided, when did you know I'm ready to tackle a novel? Not even necessarily because you thought I'm at that, I'm good enough right now to write a full novel, but maybe you just reached a point where just emotionally you felt ready.
Yeah, I guess when I did start the first novel, I felt that I could handle the craft side, the prose at a sentence level, et cetera. And I thought I'd learned a lot about pacing and character development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought I had my basic toolbox. I knew there were going to be new things that would come up in a novel just because of the length that I'd have to learn. But what I tell people is that I started the novel because all my short stories stopped being short. Like I kept writing stories that were, over 10,000 words long, and there are fewer and fewer markets for the longer the story gets. So I think my brain was telling me that I was ready to try something longer, something bigger.
You were stretching out already, and so yeah, it was indicative of a person ready to really stretch out and do the 80 or 100,000 words. So are your books entirely self-published, or do you have an agent, or do you just self-publish?
So my first two collections were were traditional publishers. They were small publishers. One was PS Publishing in the UK. Put out. They actually invited me to do a collection of what they called their what they call it, Spotlight series. Um, they're trying to highlight what they thought were up and coming writers. And by putting out these mini collections, they were limited print run, hardcover, jacketed hardcover, signed and numbered, etc. So that was my first collection. Even though they wanted new short stories, so I had to write I think two new short stories just for that one. And then I put out a second collection, and I would have been well into writing the novel at this point with a Canadian publisher called Cheesine. They're not in existence anymore. And that was what I call my full collection. It had about 16 stories in it. Um, but yeah, since then, I am strictly indie published. The four novels, the collection that's coming out right now, the Playing the Short Game, Writer's Guide, etc. And probably
Does
the
that mean
next
that
novel that will
you
come out.
spend a lot of time marketing, or is that not really your strength or your interest, the marketing part of it?
I don't do a lot. There are a number of promo sites where you can they have large mailing lists. You can discount a book and get it promoted there. Works particularly well with like the books in a series. because it will draw people to that series and they'll buy the other titles as well. But no, I don't. I mean, I'm not. I have a website at a fairly decent sized mailing list newsletter, um, and I've the indie terms. I'm wide, so I'm not just on Amazon. I'm on Barnes and Noble and Kobo and Apple and Google Play and I have my own store tied to my website as well. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, marketing is not a thing that I spend a lot of time on. Um, Probably should, but it's not something
It's the part of the
really
business, and
enjoy that much.
most
Yeah,
writers, yeah, most writers want to, yeah, they want to do the writing. They don't want to do the marketing of it. And to hire people to do the marketing is expensive and it's really questionable, whether it'll work or not. What is your
yeah.
writing regimen? So when you're in the middle of a project, which I think you are now, I want to ask you what you're working on. But before we get to that, are you morning writer, midday, evening writer? Is it catch as catch can?
No, I'm definitely not a morning person. Our house is a night owl house. Um, my ideal, and this kind of got ideal routine that got broke up by COVID is, I'd try to get to the local library um, about 11 o'clock. I'd have a lunch with me and a thermos of coffee, and I'd try to get 4.5, 5 hours of writing. More than that, I found my brain would just kind of turn to mush. The advantage I always found of going somewhere to write was um, fewer distractions, and you kind of have the mindset, well, I'm here now. I came here to write, so might as well write. So that was my routine. It tends to be that still, but in my home office, um, and probably not 5 hour stretches because there are more distractions. But I still try to put those hours in when I'm doing a writing day.
Did you say 4 to 5 hours?
4 to
Or,
5 hours, yeah.
yeah, that's a good long stretch. Do you do the any of the tricks where, it's the method where you go for 20 minutes or 30 minutes and then you take a 10 or 15-minute break and then come back to it just to keep energy
Yeah.
level high and to move around some?
Yeah, the Pomodoro timer. I've
That's
got,
it.
yeah, yeah. I've got that on my notebook. I've got it on my phone, etc. Especially when I was doing the long stretches at a library, I just, set it, take a 10-minute break. It was a big library. Just take a walk around the floor and then come back.
Now, what are you working on now, Douglas?
I'm in the midst of editing an audio edition of my first novel, The Wolf at the End of the World. And the chap has sent me all the narrated chapters, and I just finished editing the first act, so about a third of it. Um, I just put out a ebook box set of my trilogy that came out in September. And then I'm got my third English collection is coming out in March. And I'm just about to send that out to my ARC readers, um, which is a subset of my mailing list. And another advantage of having a good mailing list, you can draw on them for beta readers and ARC readers, etc. And then in terms of actually creating something new, I'm probably about 40,000 words into a near future post-apocalyptic science fiction novel, which is um, it's an extension of a number of short stories I've done written in that universe, specifically around one character I wrote about in one longer short story.
Now, getting back to the fact that you have sold short stories multiple times, the same story is educate me on this. Do the various magazines, you let them know, well, this has been published here and there, and they say that's fine because we have a different readership and we're going to run and we'd like to publish it as well? Or do they ask you to do anything with it just to give it a little tiny bit of different flavor?
No, so first of all, I'm not sure what your listeners will understand about rights to fiction and short fiction. Um, But the first time you sell a story, you are licensing first rights. We say you sold the story, but what you're really doing is you're licensing first rights to that story to that publisher. Um, if you sign a good contract, then they're going to have a reversion clause in that contract, and that means your story will come back to you. It reverts, those rights revert to you, but they come back to you as second rights. So you can sell that story again and again and again. But the next time and the 22nd time you get someone to publish your story, you're going to be licensing second rights to them. Now, before you submit a story, you need to look at the market's guidelines. And the top pro markets don't take reprints, and they will very clearly say original stories only, or we do not accept previously published stories, etc., something like that. So what you're looking for in the reprints is a market that does say that, yes, we accept reprints, or previously published fiction is fine. They're likely to pay less, but as I said, you can sell a story as many times as you can find someone who's willing to publish it. It's always going to be second rights. I've got stories that I've sold 2 dozen times. Um, you also have the option of submitting to foreign language markets if you can find markets that will translate for free and don't mind that your story has originally been published somewhere in English. In fact, a lot of them prefer that. Like if you can send them a story that's been in, Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction or Asimov's or one of the top pro markets, it's kind of a cachet for them. It improves the quality of their slush pile, and it's something they can put on the cover of their magazine. So yeah, there's a lot of things you can do with short stories after you've sold them the first time. And of course, the other one is what I mentioned is you can package up the ones you've published individually in various markets and put them into your own collection.
Hmm. Hmm. So, why do you write? What is it about writing that attracted you and obviously has retained you, Douglas? I mean, what's the rewards? What are the rewards of writing?
Ah, wow, I don't know. I think most writers are sick puppies. Um,
I mean,
you know, we
another way to look at this is the writing life. I mean, you're living the writing life now. You're retired, so you don't have that
yeah.
full-time job that just depletes you. You come home and then it's like I have nothing left. That's not the case anymore. So you might look at it from that vantage, just the kind of the writing life. It obviously appeals to you.
Yeah, I mean, at this point in my life, it's great to have a hobby. People always ask me, so what are you going to do when you retire? And I said, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep writing. Um, I think, it for me, and I think for a lot of writers, I'm not sure how you feel about it, Mike, but there's just this feeling of discomfort when you have story ideas in your head um, that haven't been, put down onto the screen or onto paper yet. Um, Zelazny, I mentioned Roger Zelazny before. He used to say that, the only way he could exercise these story ideas, these characters in his head to get them out of his head and stop bugging him was to write them down into a story. And I think there's a bit of that. Um, we've all got our list of stories and a story journal or whatever. And sometime an idea will pop up out of that list and say, yeah, it's probably time to try to write that one. Um, it's probably not a very good answer other than I can't imagine not writing or maybe jump
Hmm.
ahead for a dark ending. You're lying on your deathbed. I think I would deeply, deeply regret that I had stopped writing and I would be thinking about all the stories that I never brought to life. Not saying they'd
Right.
be any good or not. I'm just saying it. I know it would bother me that I didn't try to create one of those.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Just the feeling that I'm really not the same person if I'm not writing. It's just part of who I am, as frustrating as it can be, and so on. Was there a turning point in your writing life, Douglas? Or was there a time when whether it was a really valuable lesson you learned that really kind of propelled you, or you just reached a point where you knew I'm gonna be okay with this. I'm good at this. I'm going to uh, be successful with it.
Gee, I don't know. Probably definitely that first acceptance. I mean, I think every writer remembers the thrill of, opening an email or opening a letter for me back then, and finding out that somebody wants to publish your work. There's always that. Um, And then the next step, I think probably you start getting encouraging rejections, which sounds like an oxymoron, but where a busy editor is actually taking time to scribble on the standard form rejection or add it to the email to say, look, hey, really enjoyed this one, came close, please send us more. I mean, that's great. That's almost like a sale. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of beginning writers who just continue to get energized with things like that and give them a reason for writing. I'd say with me, even now, um, I'm not a Stephen King. I'm never going to be a Stephen King. But I look at some of the writers that I admire, um, who have said wonderful things about my work, and I think that's great. I mean, I can Charles DeLint, Robert J. Sawyer, um, Spider Robinson. I mean, it's great to be able to, I got the quotes on my website, to have writers who have won major awards who are saying really nice things about your work.
Oh yeah, that's
I
big.
think
That is
there's
big.
always that. Yeah.
Now, what inspires you most on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis in terms of, I'm thinking, obviously if you're reading something inspiring, that's one thing. I don't know if you watch streaming series that sometimes just that just stimulate you in terms of, I am anxious to get back to the keyboard because of the way this thing is structured or the quality of the script for the show or movie. What really inspires you and gets you? I mean, when we sit down as writers, it's not the same experience every time. Um, there are times when it's drudgery, and there are times when we feel inspired. What gets you to what delivers inspiration for you?
I certainly do not take, creative inspiration from entertainment that I consume. And I mean, our family is a huge movie-going family, so we'll probably see 80 plus movies a year at least, not counting what you watch on streaming services. Um, I just like that because I enjoy consuming that type of entertainment. I don't think I've ever taken a story idea from something like that. I guess what gets me back to the page is that, even when it's not going well, there's just that indescribable feeling that you finally make a hard scene work and it does exactly what you wanted it to do, and you've moved that character to the next place on their journey. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
the thrill I get from it.
yeah, I know that feeling. I think any writer probably knows that feeling who's been at it for a while. My guest has been uh, Canadian author Douglas Smith, multi-award winning author. He writes novels, short stories, nonfiction. And if you're interested in writing short stories, he one of his books is one of his nonfiction books is Playing the Short Game: How to Market and Sell Short Fiction. If you look in the episode notes, there is a link to Douglas's website where you can learn more about him and buy his work. Douglas Smith, thank you for coming on the program. Really appreciate your time and your insights.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Mike. It's been fun. I appreciate the opportunity.